Let's get joined up. This week's show is sponsored by Bandcamp.com, an online record store and music community where passionate fans discover, connect with, and directly support the artists they love. There's thousands of bands and artists on there, including my band, the Rye Dogs, whose second album, Pigs Might Fly, is out right now. Here's a quick snippet of the title track, which is also available on Spotify, Amazon, and Apple Music. It's totally free to join Bandcamp, and as the Rye Dogs are brand new members, we're now looking to grow our fan base, so your support would be greatly appreciated. Just search the Rye Dogs, that's W-R-Y Dogs, and hit the follow button. Right, now we can cue the theme tune. Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 179 with Norwegian writer Camilla Bruce talking about her new book, The Witch in the Well, and telling us why it's so important to think about what your readers want. A very quick catch up from me before we get to that. Aside from having a cold, as you can no doubt hear from my voice, it's been a busy week for me, hopping between the day job, the new novel and the as yet to be announced Joined Up Writing non-fiction project I mentioned in last week's intro. Some of you have started getting in touch with ideas about what you'd like to see in the book, but I'm still open to your input in this initial phase of putting everything together, so continue to send me your ideas. That would be brilliant. I think I've come up with an early concept to hang it on, and I've even designed a rough cover for the book. I know this might seem like a bizarre thing to do at so early a stage in the process, but I find sometimes it helps me to connect with it better, to make things seem kind of more real and create the feeling that I'm working towards a concrete goal. I've also set myself a deadline to complete the first draft by the middle of August, which might seem like a long way off, but don't forget I'm still working on a novel and I have a full-time job. There's also lots of time-consuming transcription and editing to do. I'd love to be in a position to put this book out in November this year. That's my kind of aim. As usual, I'm putting my head on the chopping block by telling you all of this, but it's an attempt to make myself accountable. I've also started making preparations for a talk that I've got scheduled in March, talking to a writing group about my big screen writing concepts, which form part of a one-day workshop that I've run a few times for writing groups in the past, and I hope to run again in the coming months. I use my script and screenwriting experience and apply some of those tips and techniques to novel writing, and you can find out more if you go over to waynekellyWrites.com and click on the workshops tab. Who knows, maybe if there's enough interest in the future, I could put something together for an online version of the workshop. I don't know if that's something that any of you would be interested in. Let me know by getting in touch, tweeting me at JU Podcast or emailing me wayne@waynekellyWrites.com or dropping me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join one or both of the email mailing lists at joinedupwriting.co.uk or waynekellyWrites.com. They're both totally free and you get a couple of downloadable goodies when you sign up, and you'll be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. So, right, I said it would be a quick update, and it is, so let's forget all of my jibber-jabber and let's get to today's interview with Camilla Bruce. So, Camilla is a Norwegian writer of speculative and historical fiction. She's got a master's degree in comparative literature, and she co-ran a small press publishing dark fairy tales. She currently lives in Trondheim with her son and cat, and her new book, The Witch in the Well, is out everywhere on February the 23rd. So enjoy the chat, and I'll pop back at the end to wrap things up. So thanks for joining me on Joined Up Writing, Camilla. Really appreciate it. So why don't we just start off, just tell me how things are going for you, and tell the listeners whereabouts you are in the world, where you're speaking from.
Yeah, I'm in Norway, in middle of Norway. And I just about to have a new book out in the UK. It's actually my second one of the year. So I
Wow.
have been been lucky
And it's only
this year.
January.
Yeah, it's only January. So yeah, I have two books out in the UK this year. But I understand that today we're talking about The Witch in the Well, which is
That,
out in February.
that's right. That's right. It's out in just well, as we record this, it's just out in just a few weeks' time. So yeah, tell us a little bit about that book, The Witch in the Well. Tell us what the premise is.
Premise is it's a story about two childhood friends, or at least they used to be childhood friends, but they have had a rift. And one of them is living in a place called just F. And the other one, she just visited F as a child for summer vacations, and that's when they played together. But something happened, and they don't like each other much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And the one who stayed in F, Kathy, she's a very special woman. She's not very well liked, not even by herself, I would say. But she has one passion in her life since her divorce, and that's the story of Elspeth Clark, who was a woman who was probably wrongly accused of witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
And but she was acquitted. But
Sure.
the villagers in F, they didn't believe it. They still thought that she was a witch and that she was responsible for several child murders that happened back then. So they took her and they murdered her. They threw her in a well. And Kathy is obsessed with this story. She feels this connection to the wrongly accused Elspeth because she herself feels like she's being wrongfully judged or disliked in F. And when Elena, who is the other woman, the one who was just visiting for summers, comes back to F, she also finds this story, and she's already an established writer, but she's writing about self-help books about how you can speak to your soul. And she comes to the story of Elspeth from a slightly different angle because she believes that there's a story there about female empowerment and real witchcraft, but positive witchcraft, nature loving. Yeah.
Sure.
So she wants to write about that. And this causes a big conflict about the two women.
It sounds fascinating. So there's potential revenge at the heart of it. There's mistrust amongst friends, and then there's this backdrop of the folklore and the witches as well. It sounds fascinating. So what do you remember? Kind of what the initial inspiration for this book was? Was there something that triggered the idea for you when you first started out?
Well, I am and have always been interested in the historical basis for the witch stories, the witch trials.
Yeah.
So I have read a lot about them, and I have read transcripts. And one thing that we, especially in popular culture, the most stereotypical witch that we have now is the midwife or the cunning woman, the misunderstood cunning woman who is actually very good at heart, but is wrongfully accused, who lives in a cabin in the woods, or and when I read about these old stories, I found that quite often women were accused just for being rude. You can have an argument with your neighbor, and if the neighbor's cow got sick the next day, you could risk getting the blame for that.
Yeah.
So I was started to think about this with the imperfect victim.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to write something about that, about women who aren't necessarily likable or necessarily good at heart, but who is still wrongfully accused of something or suspected of something. So that was sort of my initial inspiration.
That was your kind of jumping off point for it.
Yeah. I've always been very fascinated by folklore, and especially the Norwegian one, because, I grew up in a forest, so it was all around me all the time. Yeah.
It caused you many a nightmare, I should imagine, when you were trying to sleep.
Oh no, I wanted to be one of them. I was like, oh yeah.
And that's why you write the books now. It's never scared you. You want to actually write about it.
Yeah, I do. And I think you can tell a lot about society or about a person by looking at what they're scared of. How do the monsters look like? What do
Uh,
they do?
yeah.
What's the frightening thing at the core of the belief, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Well, why do you think people are still so fascinated by witches in particular? I mean, do you think it's, I mean, for you writing about witches, is it a useful way to kind of talk about more modern female issues?
But I think that a lot of people in real life who are drawn to witchcraft do so with a desire or a hope to be able to control a life or a situation that feels where you feel powerless. This
Hmm.
is a way to gain power or even just a sense of power.
Hmm.
And I think that can sometimes be enough to make a bad situation feel easier when you
Hmm.
think that you have some way of manipulating. And I think that for uh, women throughout history, must have been a very appealing thought. And
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
that's why the witch in folklore has turned out to be so scary and off-putting, because it is female power.
yeah. It's a woman in power, as you say, and that's kind of can be quite frightening to certain members of society.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, even now, yeah.
And another thing is that one thing that we don't talk too much about, I think, is that witchcraft is enormously creative. And
Hmm.
it's also sensual because you have all these herbs and these sachets and dolls, and it's you make things. It's a creative process where you sort of, and that has always been women's area of expertise. Spinning, weaving, sewing. You know,
Hmm.
and I think that it sort of takes the traditional female chores and make them more, because you can create more than a piece of garment. You can create a new thread for your life, or you can change an outcome, or you can, so it's
Yeah.
sort of,
Well, people
yeah,
often talk about sort of, magical thinking. People often talk about
yeah.
nowadays, and they often, as you say, it kind of refers to self-help books and things like that, positive thinking and magical thinking about visualizing the kind of life that you might want or the future or outcomes about things. And this idea that you can kind of manifest it in some way. And it's not too dissimilar to that, is it?
No, it isn't. I just think that, the modern philosophies are just a reinvention of the old things. And sometimes I'm like, especially when, self-help gurus, they try to explain this in a sort of not a real scientific way, but in a quasi scientific
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they have lifted the witchcraft out of the dark cabin and the kitchen table with the flickering candlelights and into a more um, sterile environment, a more
Yeah. The person's
scientific.
wearing a white coat instead of a
Yeah, yeah.
witch's hat.
But it's actually the same thing, it's
Yeah,
the exact same thing. It's what traditional witchcraft was all about, to manifest things by wishing it and wanting it and maybe adding a little spell or something, but it's basically the same thing.
definitely. So let's go back a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about you. So how did you come to writing in the first place? What are kind of your earliest memories of writing?
Oh, that was I think I started writing scary stories actually when I was very young, in what do you call your first school?
Hmm.
The
Primary
first school
school.
you go
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah, primary school. Yes. I always mix up the American and the
Yeah. Yeah.
British. Yeah. And I remember one time, I think I was about 9 or 10, and I was a very early reader. So I started reading books very early, and also scary books. My mom didn't know, but I did. I read a lot of scary books very early. So I read Dracula when I was 11, I think. And when I was about 10, I remember we had this assignment in class and we could write whatever we wanted. So I wrote about this horrific, terrible trip to a cabin where all those who were in the trip were haunted, and they met a skeleton in the outhouse, and I loved it. I thought it was great. And my teacher was so concerned that the next time we were going to have an assignment. She said, you have to write about a sunny day at grandma's, while the rest of the class could write whatever they wanted.
That's terrible.
So, yeah, I think about it now. It's like, I was right. You were wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So she was a bit frightened by it, but really she should have been sort of encouraging your passion for it.
Yeah, obviously, because now I'm writing books. So, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And so do you sort of remember what point you thought this might be something that I'd like to try to do professionally rather than just something that you did for fun in your spare time?
Yeah, I'm like a lot of writers in that I always wanted to write. It has always been sort of the main goal of my life, but things got in the way. I became a mom early, single mom,
Yeah.
and I had to finish my education. Things got in the way all the time.
Yeah.
So I was actually well past 30 when I realized that if I was ever going to do this, I had to do it now. And then I had inherited some money, so I rented a house out in the field, far away from the city, and spent a year writing there.
That's
and
great.
Produced 3 manuscripts, and none of them were really good. But I did learn a lot.
Yeah.
So the next one was You Let Me In, which was my debut.
Yeah, your successful debut. So as you say, a lot of people talk about writing those early books, and a lot of people don't even finish those early attempts at books, but they're often the best way to learn, aren't they?
They are, and even if it feels really daunting the first time you write a lengthy manuscript, but the 10th time you do it, it's not that bad. It's sort of you just have to come over that first hurdle, and then it gets easier.
Do you remember what it felt like to finish the first one that you tried? Do you remember what it was like when you actually got to the end?
Yeah, and I was like, I felt like I had climbed the Mount Everest. It was like victory.
Yeah.
But then I let it lie for a while, and when I went back and looked at it, I was like, okay, I have to start over. I have to do something different. So yeah, but also I think that the more you write, the better you get at self-editing, so you can see the flaws and the weaknesses in your manuscript early on instead of going through making the same mistakes over and over. So it's all about experience.
Definitely. So when you got to that, what became your successful debut, tell me give us a sense of your path to publication. So how did that book get out into the world eventually?
Well, I had realized that my stuff was not for the Norwegian market, because it's a very small market, and we don't really have much room for paranormal books or mysteries. It's more about crime and literary fiction in Norway. So I already knew that I had to write in English, and that I had to try to get it out of to reach the English speaking markets. So that was, of course, something that perhaps made my path a little longer, because I had to become good enough in English to, And I started sending out to agents like any other author. And after, I think I did that. I was at it with different manuscripts, though, for about 2 or 3 years before I landed an agent with You Let Me In. But that time, I actually just sent the manuscript to 3 agents, because it was a special book, and I didn't think it was for everyone. So I sort of narrowed it down to 3, and then I landed my dream agent. So I was very, very happy with that, and I've been with her ever since.
That's brilliant. So it's interesting, obviously, as you say, writing in English. So when you first started, well, presumably when you first started writing, you were writing in your native language. How was the change for you? And now when you write, excuse my ignorance, but like, are you sort of thinking in your native language and then decoding it as you go, or do you think when you're actually writing in English, do you think in English?
I think in English when I write, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it would be the languages are too different for anything else to work. Translating is sort of something else
Yeah. Yeah.
entirely.
Yeah.
But it's also sort of it has become my routine. I put on the hat when I sit down to write. I start thinking in English.
Hmm.
It just happens automatically.
Yeah.
I think sometimes I think of it as if when a chef takes on his jacket and
Yeah.
goes into the kitchen. Yeah, it's like that with the language
You're
for me.
you're getting into character it
Yeah,
almost.
yeah. I put on my English jacket and go, yeah, do my thing.
And off you
But
go.
I
And do
think it
you,
start
and have you read, presumably as well as you were growing up or whatever, you read lots of English language literature, did you? Lots of English language books.
when I was about 20, I started reading books in English. And before that, they hadn't been that accessible. But when I was about 20, the internet was suddenly a thing, and you can start ordering
Hmm.
books from beyond the sea.
Yeah.
So that's when I started reading in English and also writing in English because, as I mentioned before, I had my son very early,
Hmm.
and that meant that when I was young, I had a lot of time to sit in at night with my baby.
Hmm.
And the internet was fairly new at that point,
Yeah.
but I found writing groups and I started to write fan fiction, and then that's when I started to write in English as well.
It's kind of how you found your way. What sorts of books do you like to read, or what sorts of book do you like to read? These kind of books, these kind of genre books, or things with a supernatural edge? Is that what you're into, or have you got quite a broad taste?
Um, Everyone likes to say that they have a broad taste, but I have to admit that I am a big fan of genre books,
Hmm.
and especially those with a supernatural element.
Yeah.
Um, so I write some horror and some thrillers and a good mix. There's some fantasy.
Hmm. And it all feeds into what you do
Yeah.
in one way or another, like everything does. So, as you say, so the Witch in the Well is your third book that's going to come on. But what would you say you've learned across those? This being your third book,
It's
that's
my fourth
it's
actually
your
in the
fourth, is it? Oh,
UK.
sorry. Okay, it's
Hmm
your fourth book.
Because I had another book out last week in
Ah,
the UK.
right.
But I'm writing in different genres. So I had the speculative fiction,
I see. Yeah.
which is You Let Me In and The Witch in the Well.
Yeah.
But I also write historical thrillers based on true events.
Right.
So sort
Right.
of true crime-ish about female vintage serial killers, to be very specific.
Oh, great. That sounds
So
interesting as well. So,
yeah.
but the point stands really from the point of view. So as you say, you've written multiple books at this stage. What do you think you've learned over the course of that time? You know, what skills have you learned? Has your process changed since your debut? Has the way that you write or the way you approach things now changed?
Well, one thing is that you're always talking about how you have to be true to yourself and true to your process, and but it's very hard when you're published and you're writing for publication to completely ignore the idea, what do your readers want, what do they
Hmm.
expect of you, and how will they react to this or that. So that's something that's a part of my process now.
Yeah.
And for me as a Norwegian, there's also a cultural aspect, because sometimes things that would be completely fine to write about in Norway just won't fly in the US, for instance.
Yeah.
So you also have to sort of uh, think about who you're writing for, and also think that they might be very different from you in
Yeah.
how they meet the text. Yeah.
And those cultural differences. And I'm guessing that you're part of that is the editing process of working with an editor. Do they tend to pick up things like that?
Yeah, they do. They do. And so there's been some rounds there where I just have to, but this is the way I have the path I have chosen. So you just have to deal with it. But sometimes I'm very surprised by what is and what
Yeah.
is not acceptable other places. Yeah.
Yeah. That's something you've had to get used to. So how and when do you write? How do you fit it around sort of real life? You mentioned you've got a child as well, so there's all that to deal with. So how and when do you write?
But my child is grown now. You
Hmm.
know, I'm not I'm not that young anymore. So
You and me
he's
both.
sort of so he's handling himself perfectly, so that's fine.
That's good.
Right now I have, over the last few years, I have chosen to just have a day job in sort of temp positions, so
Hmm.
I can focus on my writing in between, because before that I was like worked 9 to 5, and then I slept for an hour on the couch, and then I was up and wrote long into the night, and
Hmm.
slept 3 hours and up at work, and it just wasn't sustainable over
No.
time. So for me now, it's like when I feel like I haven't seen people for a very long time, I apply, or I take or get offered a temp position, and I take that. And so that's how I've been working lately, so that I have stretches of time when I can just focus on writing in between.
And when you sit down to write, when you have a writing session, do you try to write every day, or is it a couple of times a week, or just when the feeling takes you? How does that work?
Oh, that's every day. I have found that if I leave my manuscript alone for too long, it sort of goes stale on me. So
Hmm.
I have to keep working all the time to keep the flow going. And
Yeah,
also you forget these little details, what
I
color
agree.
the
Yeah,
dress had in chapter
yeah,
2. So you
yeah.
have to, yeah.
It's
So
something
it's
that you put
easier.
in. Yeah, and I've got a bad memory as well, so I always end up having to read back what I've written last time, and then by the time I've done that, I've run out of time to write.
Yeah, that's also a problem. So I just try to do it every day, and I have like uh, the way I'm working now, I'm trying to do a chapter a day, and even if it's a chapter of 1,000 words, so 3,000 words, it's a chapter a day. That's my
And
my
that's a good session
goal
for you.
right now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's great. What would you say is your favorite part of the process, of the whole process from the beginning to the end? Is there a part that you enjoy more than the others?
I feel like it's different from each book. It's some books I love the drafting. The
Hmm.
drafting stage is perfect. I love it. And other books, it's like the editing process is a lot more interesting and fulfilling. So it varies.
It just depends. And do you like to plan everything out when you first start, or do you just like to see where the story takes you?
Before I was definitely not a planner. Before I was published, then I just started out and went where the wind blew.
Hmm.
But after that, after I started working with publishers, of course they want an outline, and they want to know where the story is going before you jump in.
Hmm.
So I have become more of a planner, and I also feel like I like it more now. Actually, I do like to know where to go, so I won't keep making mistakes and have to go back and rewrite to have this. Yeah. So
And do you
I would
tend to
say I
do
have.
sorry, go on.
I, I feel like I have a rough outline of where the story is going, and I know how it is going to end. But then I have some wriggle room
Yeah,
in there
that's
too.
what that was going to ask. I was going to say, do you find from that initial outline, does the story tend to change or deviate much from that initial outline?
Maybe not much, but I would say significantly. Yeah. It
Sure.
will sort of things happen, and you meet the characters on the page, and maybe they're a little bit different than what you imagined when you wrote the outline, and you know. Mm.
Goes in slightly different places. So when you're sitting down to write today's chapter or tomorrow's chapter or whenever you next sit down, do you have little tricks or do you do certain things to get into the zone, to get into the right headspace? So if you open your manuscript now on your whichever bit of software that you use to write your books, do you do you have music on in the background, or do you reread the last half of the chapter before? Give me a sense of what happens when you sit in the chair to get ready to write.
Well, I usually have a sentence which tells me what is supposed to happen in this chapter. So I do have a sort of an idea of where we are and how this chapter is going to move the story forward.
Yeah.
So that's my main goal with the chapter, how to, yeah. And so I have the setup in my head, so I don't really need much prompting. The hard part sometimes can be to leave the world behind, to enter the zone. That can be
Yeah.
a threshold at times, especially if you have a lot of things going on. To sort of lock yourself into that writing space can be challenging at times.
Yeah, I agree. To leave the real world behind, sort of thing.
Yeah, but when I finally do, it usually comes very fast. When I'm in the zone, I don't need much prompting. Um, I know a
And
lot of authors like to use music and stuff, and I don't usually, but I did with my last one actually. That was yeah, I had a playlist for that one.
did you have certain kinds of music, or did you choose a certain genre of music for it to create any kind of atmosphere? Or
Yeah, this is a secret project. It has not been announced yet,
oh
but
wow,
I used this vintage carnival music
all
that I
right.
had going. Yeah, so
That
that
sounds
was very
interesting.
effective.
Now everybody listening is going to be waiting for the next thing to come out and wonder what it was that inspired it. So we look
Yeah.
forward to finding out about that. And so what would you say drives you to write? Obviously it's been something that's been there since you were a little girl. So what would you say drives you to write? Because it's hard work at times, as you say, especially when you're fitting it around other things and having to work and all the other things. So what drives you to sit down and bash out the words?
I think it's, you know, uh, uh, if you really dig deep, I think it's the love of storytelling.
Hmm.
Actually,
Hmm.
it's for some of us, it's just a drive. You love to tell stories, you love to create worlds, you love to, create texture and feelings and drama and when I was young, I also uh, did think for a very brief time that I was going to be an actor, and that was also about the storytelling, but then you
Yeah.
had the stage instead of the page. And so I think that for some of us it's almost like a curse. You cannot avoid it. You try not to tell stories and you tell stories anyway. So I don't know if we really have much of a choice.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that there's definitely some overlap with the idea of being an actor, because I often think when I'm writing it, you're almost acting out all the different parts of the story anyway. When you write it, you're getting the opportunity to jump in and out of different characters and tell their story and be them for a period of time, aren't you? When you're writing.
Yeah, you are. And that's the great thing about writing, because you can actually be all the characters. You can go in and out of any character you want to, and you can create them yourself. And it's sort of like a game. It's a very strange but also very fulfilling game of masks, maybe,
Mm,
that you can change your persona all the time as a writer.
yeah, definitely. And when you write, do you tend to have a similar sort of POV with your books? Are they written in third person point of view, or do you like to write in first person, or don't you really have any rules with that, and it just depends on the story that you're telling?
First person.
Yeah.
And actually, I for me it was actually a big turning point when I went from third to first person. So
Hmm.
if someone is struggling to sort of uh, get their writing to the next level, I would recommend changing point of view, or changing
Hmm.
tense, because I did that and suddenly everything clicked in place. And You Let Me In was actually the first manuscript where I did that, when I wrote the first person book,
And
and it flew. So yeah.
that's a good tip. And as regards tense, were you writing in present tense and then you changed to past, or were you writing in past and you were writing and now you're writing present? Talk to me about that.
With You Let Me In, I changed from, actually that one is a mixture of present and past. But before that, I had consequently been writing in past tense. So to sort of start writing in present tense, sort of, the material felt more immediate, you know?
Yeah.
So to play around with those things, I think that could be really useful to shake loose something new.
And what is it that you like about first person in particular, do you think?
I think it's the idea about really being in someone's head again, because you really are. And I also, for me, it's easier to create a whole person, a whole character when I'm inside their head looking out.
Yeah. And taking on a different voice.
Yeah.
Depending on their age or who they are or where they're from
Yeah.
and all the rest of it. So if you could go back to when you first started writing or to your younger self, what would you do differently, if anything? Is there anything that would you approach it differently? Would you think about things differently?
Well, for the longest time, I only wrote short stories because I felt like a whole novel was too daunting. I didn't know where to start with it. So I would definitely tell myself to just do it, just stick with it. Even if, I was, when you're young, you're sort of, you want the reward faster. So I was like, oh, I can write a short story and I'll be done in 3 days. Yay. But it doesn't make a novel. So I would have told myself to be more disciplined, and maybe I could have started earlier, gotten where I am now a lot earlier.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, maybe I wasn't, I have a maturity now and I have experiences that I didn't have back then. So maybe it was a good thing that it took me a while to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's the kind of most helpful piece of creative or inspirational advice that somebody else has given to you along the way, or something that somebody's told you that's kind of changed things for you or made a difference, or that you maybe refer to now?
Actually, I'm sure a lot of writers say this, but I read On Writing by Stephen King.
Yeah.
And something he said in there that resonated with me as a Norwegian speaking English writing author was that, because I always felt that I don't have all the words because I haven't grown up in the English speaking culture. I don't have all the words. And he said, use the tools you have. Don't try to make up words or look in dictionaries, or you use the words you have. And that was enormously freeing for me to just, get this permission to just use the words I had in my word bank instead of trying to, sound fancier than I am.
Yeah, that's great advice, because as you say, sometimes the temptation is to just find that fancy word, or something that sounds clever, when really you should be clear and direct and just get your point across as succinctly as possible. Absolutely. Well, as we kind of wrap things up and we move towards wrapping things up, why don't you can you give people a sense? Well, first of all, just remind them when the book is out, when it's released here, and tell people where they can find out more about you online.
Yeah, the book, The Witch in the Well, is out on February 23, and you can find me online on camillabruce.com, and I'm also on Twitter as Millacream and on Instagram as CamillaBruce_writing.
Brilliant. Well, I'll put all of those show notes up in the all those things up in the show notes so people can follow you. That would be great. And can you give us a sense of what's coming up next, or is it still all under wraps?
It's all under wraps so far. So
exciting.
Yeah, but there is more coming.
I get that sense. I get that sense. That's great. Well, it's been brilliant to speak to you, Camilla, but for now, thanks for joining me on Joined Up Writing.
And thank you so much for having me.
Joined Up Writing.
There you go. Thanks again to Camilla, and I'll put all of her links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, other than me reminding you to make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts, and that way you can have the podcast downloaded automatically every time. You won't miss an episode. Also, remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen to the show, as it really helps others to find us. And other than that, just keep recommending it to your friends. Just one a week. That would be amazing. Other than that, thanks very much. That's it for this week, but thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing. Stay safe. I'll see you next time.